you. I have a special treat for you tonight. Those of you who are regular viewers of this show know that my usual format is to just do a solo lecture. It's usually just me and my charts and you, the viewing audience. Tonight, I'm going to try something a bit different. I'm going to conduct an interview, a very special interview. My guest tonight, Dr. Robert Eisenman, is an acknowledged Dead Sea Scroll expert of the highest caliber. In fact, in the 1990s, when you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, the name that comes to mind is Dr. Robert Eisenman, and that's because it was in the 1990s that Dr. Eisenman was the point man in the release of many Dead Sea Scrolls that had never before been released to the public. Dr. Eisenman is a high caliber scholar. He is the head of the Institute for Judeo-Christian Origins at Cal State Long Beach. He is the author of several books on the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Christian origins. Dr. Eisenman is not a representative of my church, nor is he here representing any religious institution. It's precisely because Dr. Eisenman is such a free agent that he's able to, without any constraints, simply search out the truth and release that truth to you, the public, as he has been doing in his books, which we'll get into tonight. I'm very proud to have as my guest Dr. Robert Eisenman. Professor Eisenman, for the benefit of our viewers, let's begin with a bit of biographical information. You know, where you were born, what schools you went to, what degrees you took, and what positions you've held in the academic world.
Well, actually, I'm pretty much an East Coast person. I come from, of all places, New Jersey. I was born and brought up there. I went to local schools there, local high schools, and I hope your audience won't mind, but I actually went to Ivy League schools. I first went to Cornell University, and after that, I traveled abroad a lot. I was teaching in schools in England. I went as far as India. I worked in kibbutzim in Israel. Taught school in Italy, in Iran, and in India. And then finally I came back and did a master's in Hebrew and Near East Studies at New York University. From there I went on to do a doctorate at Columbia University in Middle East languages. And that encompassed a lot of work in early Jewish studies in Palestine, early Christian studies, but also combined that with a lot of work in Islamic studies. And so that was the field that I got into. And then I went back to the Middle East and lived in Jerusalem for 4 or 5 more years, taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, taught at the University of Tel Aviv, and then finally came back here to the California State University system, where I've been teaching at Long Beach State since the early 70s. And it was at Long Beach State that actually I got interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the way I got interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls was because my students were interested in things like that. And those of you who know what State University system is, the professors have to respond to student interest. I mean, your classes go according to whether students are interested or not. And when I saw where the things that electrified and basically turned students on, because we wanted to do interesting things in our department, that's the kind of thing that I got into. And then it was through these courses that I saw the relationship of the scrolls to early Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Eisenman, a lot of your work is related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many of our viewers are familiar with that term, but little else. Many of them don't even know what country the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in. So for the benefit of the uninitiated amongst our viewers, why don't you tell the basic story, give the basic outline on where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, who discovered them, the basic Dead Sea Scroll story.
Well, there's no real agreement on the basic Dead Sea Scrolls story. It's a long story, but to try to make it as short as possible, the idea was that the scrolls were discovered around 1947, 1948 in caves along the Dead Sea. Therefore, they're called Dead Sea Scrolls. But the literature represented that actually unfolded over the next 5 or 10 years, because the discoveries, a lot of people don't realize, continued for 7 or 8, 9 more years, and all the scrolls weren't really found, the ones that we know. There may be ones that we don't know about, but the ones that we know weren't really found until the mid-50s. But in any case, the first ones were discovered, and a lot of people figured or thought or saw in that some apocalyptic significance, because they were discovered right in the middle of the Arab-Israeli arguments, dispute, and war that finally broke out in the end of 47, beginning of 48. It was at that time that the Bedouin were finding these scrolls in caves and bringing them up to Jerusalem.
And who were the Bedouin?
Well, that's it. The Bedouin, the story goes, and it's not completely clear if that is really true or not. Some say these tribes, Bedouin along the Dead Sea in the Judean wilderness, had found things earlier, but the story only came to the public at this time. But whether that's true so or not, the story that's officially told is that there was a shepherd who was tending sheep along the Dead Sea. In fact, if you know, this was not a boy, it's supposed to be a shepherd boy, this was actually a grown man, and he wasn't simply a shepherd, he was, but he was also a known treasure hunter, so he was looking for things, and basically found the jackpot. What happened was when in his spare time, he would constantly, while he was tending his flocks, look for things, and he was always throwing stones inside of caves and things, and at one particular time, he threw a stone inside of a cave, and instead of hearing clatter, 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 he heard kaplunk, 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 meaning there was broken pottery. And when he crawled in, sure enough, there were 10 or 12 scroll jars, some broken, some completely preserved, in which there were rolled scroll materials, and this is what's known as Cave 1.
And the other discoveries that you alluded to that went on for a number of years, on into the 1950s, there were other caves that were discovered? And
right.
Other
now this is where the story gets complicated, because this Bedouin boy brought the materials up to Bethlehem, which is the closest city on the plain above where the Dead Sea Scroll goes down below sea, where the Dead Sea goes down below sea level. If you climb up to the plain above, it's the Bethlehem plain. So he goes to Bethlehem to a merchant called Kando. This merchant takes the scrolls to Jerusalem to his metropolitan. He turns out to be a Syriac Christian of some kind. And this Syriac metropolitan immediately recognized that he had something very interesting here. In the meantime, some problems occurred between the representatives of the Bedouin shepherd boys and the Christian prelates in Jerusalem, so maybe they were hawking them, but some of them went over to the Israeli side in the middle of the shooting and the fighting and the what was going on there in 47, and showed them to a famous professor at the Hebrew University. That professor immediately bought half of what he had. The other half was bought by the metropolitan on the east side. All of these are what are called Cave 1. Ultimately, all these materials ended up in what the Israelis call the Shrine of the Book, or the Museum of the Book, right near their Knesset or Parliament building in West Jerusalem. Now, as far as the public knew, that was all the scrolls. But that wasn't all of the scrolls. And the story of the purchase of the Metropolitan scrolls is a very interesting one, too, because after the war, this Syriac metropolitan, who was called Father Athanasius...
And the term you're using, metropolitan, is an Eastern Orthodox term which is the equivalent of bishop.
Basically, it's a high official in the church. I wouldn't want to say, I'm not expert on it, what it's equivalent to exactly, but probably relating something to bishop of that. It's a high official in the Eastern Orthodox Syriac church, okay. Right. He got to, after the fighting, he left Palestine, left Jerusalem, and ended up, of all places, in Hoboken, New Jersey. And there, the little church that he was head of ran out of money, and in the early 50s, he had to sell off his scrolls, which he had in a tin suitcase underneath his bed in Hoboken, New Jersey, the home of Frank Sinatra. And he put an advertisement, of all places, in the Wall Street Journal, scrolls for sale. Representatives of the Israeli authorities saw these, and under third persons, secret negotiations under third persons, because he probably wouldn't have sold these back to the Israelis had he known, and he said that he wouldn't have sold it to them had he known that the third parties represented them. They bought the scrolls for some enormous amount, whether a couple of $100,000 or $500,000, I don't know how much. By that time, they'd increased in value by that much. And that's how all the scrolls from Cave 1 got in the Israel Museum on the Israel side. all the scrolls that the Bedouin boy, we think, found, though there may be some others floating around out there, ended up in the shrine of the book. And the public thought, end story. But that wasn't the end of the story.
Now, my understanding is that where we get some controversy is that these first scrolls that were discovered were translated in a relatively quick amount of time.
That's right.
And yet, other scrolls that were discovered once the official establishment got control of the Dead Sea Scroll process, a little clique, a team, was appointed, and this team was the only scholars who were allowed to see the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only ones who actually knew what had been discovered, and were in charge of the translation process. And a process begins that goes on for years, where every now and then another scroll is translated and released to the public, usually the less controversial. My question for you is, can you describe for our viewers who exactly gained control of that process? In other words, who chose the team that got to have custody of the Dead Sea Scrolls? And am I correct that actually the Catholic Church had a lot to say, and was the point man some sort of Catholic priest?
Well, David, you just asked about 50 questions in one. So I'm going to go a little slower than you, because that's too complicated what you want me to answer in one question at the end. I'd like to tell you the rest of the story a bit. What happened was that though the public, the general public thought that what the Israelis were exhibiting, and they did translate these, and they didn't try to make political capital or academic capital out of them, pretty straightforwardly, the way things should be done, and open them up to general public viewing very early on in the early 50s. The public thought that was all of them. But what happened was other Bedouin teams began to look into other caves, and that's how we look at this field. There are 11 caves, and we designate the different scrolls by what caves they came from. 11 manuscript-bearing caves. And these came to light in the late 40s, early and mid-50s, some of them not till 55, 56. So we go up to cave 11, and but by this time, the Arab-Israeli war had intervened, and so the partition of Palestine had occurred, and all the scrolls that were coming in after cave 1, that is cave 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, came in the East Jerusalem, or the Jordanian, by that time, occupied part of Palestine, actually the state of Jordan. So these scrolls went to East Jerusalem, to a place called the Rockefeller Museum. Now put yourself in a situation where the Jordanian government, ostensibly Muslim government, is getting Hebrew-written scrolls, and they are mostly in Hebrew, some Aramaic, a few Greek manuscripts, but mostly Hebrew manuscripts there, were coming in, and they are pretty authentic. They do date back to the time of Christ, whether 100 years before Christ or 100 years after Christ. Nobody is in agreement on the dating of these scrolls, and frankly, nobody likely ever will be on the precise dating. There's a fairly wide difference of opinion on that. But they certainly come from that period. And put yourself in the position of the Jordanian government. They didn't know what to do with these scrolls. Now, as it turned out, after the partition of Palestine, East Jerusalem was kind of a backwater. You couldn't get to the sea. You had to go all the way back to Amman and then fly over Lebanon even to get to East Jerusalem at that time, because the Israeli side and the Arab side were totally divided and weren't talking to it, and there was a no man to each other. There was a no man's land in between. The head of the Jordan society at that point was the same ruler we have today, King Hussein. But on the spot in East Jerusalem were a group of French prelates, mostly Dominican fathers, centered at a school called the École Biblique.
And for the benefit of the viewers, the Dominicans are an order of monks within the Catholic Church.
The Dominicans are an extremely conservative order of monks within the Catholic Church, and have always been very orthodox and conservative doctrinally speaking. And the father who was in control of this École Biblique was the head of the Dominican order in Palestine, an individual named Father DeVoe. Now, you have a book on your table there, The Dead Sea Scroll Deception, which actually covers this whole history in great detail. And I probably, much better than you and I could do it here, but that is the subject of that book by Bajan and Lee, which came out in the early 90s. I think it was actually published in 1992, if I'm not mistaken. So they do go through the whole discovery process and who was behind what and who controlled what. to make a long story short, it became clear that the fathers, the religious-oriented fathers who had a direct a line into more official circles in Rome, were looking very carefully at these materials. Now, their position is, to be fair, that they were trying to stop the crazies from getting involved. But whatever the reason for all this was, a kind of veil of secrecy fell down over the scrolls from around 1955 on. And the most important reason behind that was the discovery of a weird scroll called the copper scroll. The copper scroll was two pieces of scroll on copper plate. The reason for it was to put on a metal like that was obviously so it would be preserved. When this was unrolled and translated, it turned out to be a treasure list, a temple treasure list, a list of the treasure of the temple. And there were all kinds of theories why they would be having a group that you'll later talk about are the Essenes, why they would be in control of a temple treasure list. But what happened was this made people think maybe it isn't just Essenes we have here, but more revolutionary groups, zealot Essenes, groups like that. And the editing team that had control began to worry about the relation of this to Christianity, and so really a blanket of secrecy came down from 55 until the late 80s.
Okay, and just to try to pin you down on this one point, I'm
not sure I'm going to be pinned down, but
okay,
go ahead.
Okay, but am I correct that this Father DeVoe, the Catholic priest, was the chief man of the team in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and at least the majority of the other men on that team in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls were also Catholic? Is that correct?
Well, there was an international team put together, and originally there were some Protestant members of that team, but as things went on, feelings exacerbated, and most of the Protestant members either were forced off or for one reason or another left the team. The original editing committee was always Judenrein. That means there were never any Jewish scholars on it. So it wasn't really an international team at all, but yes, the most sensitive documents, what we call the extra-biblical documents, went under the control of a largely circle of people with strong relations to the church.
Okay. Now, Dr. Eisenman, the Catholic Church for 2,000 years.
I don't want to get too deep into the Catholic Church here because that's not my subject that I want to deal with too much. But go ahead, I'll listen to it.
Sure, but to lead into something that you're personally noted for, which is the freeing up of some of these Dead Sea Scrolls, it's good to first point out that there was something that needed freeing up.
Right.
The Dead Sea Scrolls could impinge upon Christian doctrines, Christian dogmas, church dogmas.
Right. At that time, it was all one church, and in the West, and later on, it became divided up many churches.
And whether we're talking about the Catholic Church or mainline Protestant churches, they have some cherished doctrines that when some ancient manuscripts are discovered, and those ancient manuscripts might impinge on some of the cherished doctrines of the church, obviously there's going to be a certain amount of concern. Now, whether or not there was an actual attempt to cover up sensitive aspects of the Dead Sea Scrolls that might in fact impinge on church doctrines, or whether it was simply jealous scholarship, or no matter what it was, it's a fact, well documented by many writers, that for a long period of time, scholars such as yourself at universities who wanted access to the Dead Sea Scrolls couldn't get that access. The access was denied.
Well, absolutely. People were not, anyone who was outside the inner circle, the inner team, was denied access to these scrolls. Professor Gold, the University of Chicago, even in the early 70s, describes the pain he went through, and he was a pretty established scholar at that time in trying to get access and was totally denied. When I was in Jerusalem as a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the Auburn Institute in Jerusalem in 85, 86, I was denied, and that's what really turned me on to get into this. So people were being denied. But if you speak to the academic establishment that ran this, they said, well, again, it was to keep the crazies away, that is, unqualified people. I actually had people on the team, working on the team, who used that language to me. We wanted to keep the crazies away. The reason for this was that in 1955, when these, and this is in Bajan Lee's book, very well documented, when this copper scroll came into being and the existence of it, another father, who was Father DeVoe's assistant, called Father Milik, a Polish priest from Poland, was really the man who was the workhorse on the team. He was working on the copper scroll, and he didn't get that published till the mid-late 60s, till the late part of the middle 60s. So it took him 10 years to work on that scroll. And John Allegro, a Protestant member of the team who was later forced off the team, documents in his correspondence and in his books the pain he felt in not being allowed to talk about the copper scroll for 11 years, even though his book, Dead Sea Scrolls, came out in 1956. So people like him were frozen out totally and finally pushed off the team. So there was a certain core of people who got the most sensitive documents.
Yeah, so there was this team in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other scholars unable to access those scrolls.
Absolutely not, yeah.
And even our viewers, I know that most the general folk that I speak with about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they remember seeing over a 20 or 30 year period newspaper articles about scholars complaining that they couldn't get access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then, and most of the folks watching tonight will remember, in the 1990s, early 90s, something occurred. That something has to do with yourself. Well, and let me ask you the question this way. In the 1990s, you became a point man in the campaign to free up access
to the late 80s,
to the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls. I guess the campaign began.
I'll tell you the story. When in 85, 86, when I was at the Albright Institute on a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, hope they don't cut the National Endowment for the Humanities out, by the way, very good organization, supported people like us going to the Middle East and studying in institutions like the Albright Institute, which is the focus of American archaeological work in the Middle East. When I was there was nothing I could do. And had I known the scrolls were at the Huntington Library, not far from my home institution in San Marino, California, in Southern California, I'd have just as soon stayed home, because there was more I could have done at the Huntington Library than I ever could have done in Jerusalem.
But of course you had no way of knowing.
No, I didn't know that at that time. But as part of my adventures, I was shuffled from pillar to post. And another scholar came in with me at one point to the officials in the Shrine of the Book in Israel, a scholar called Philip Davies from the University of Sheffield, who also was a Dead Sea Scroll expert Protestant, who also couldn't get in and get any access. Nobody could get any access to any documents. What's the problem with that? The problem is, as an historian, you have to have all the data before you on the table. You can't be in a situation where you have some of the data and then another scholar says to you, oh, well, you haven't seen such and such. Oh, you don't know. Or they drop a document on you that you've never seen before, that you didn't refer to in your work, which makes all your work totally obsolescent. So you can't be in that situation as an historian. That's what I told them. What I said was, it has to be all open. And in 1986, Davies and I went into this official in the Israel government. He said, well, you should have gone to Father DeVoe. By that time, Father DeVoe was dead, and there was a successor, Father Benoit, who was head of the Dead Sea Scrolls editorial team. So then Father Benoit told us, well, you should go to the Israeli authorities. And then the Israeli authorities said, we don't have any control here. You should go to Father Benoit. And they'd go you round and round in circles. So what happened? This Israeli official said to me, you'll never see the scrolls in your lifetime. This was in 1986. And he meant it. And I said to my colleague Davies as we walked out of that interview, the hell you say, we'll see the scrolls, whatever. And in 5 years, not 5 years after that, we had total access. And this book here, the one you have on the table in front of you, was really the breaking of that monopoly. The facsimile edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you open it up, David, you can show your viewer audience that in there are all the plates that were being withheld. 1,800 plates, some of them, of course, in little fragments and tatters, but 1,800 plates that were withheld that we finally got access to, not 5 years. That was published in 1991. So literally 5 years after they told us we'd never see the scrolls in our lifetime, we had them all published for public access. And that was because of the anger we felt and the frustration we felt that this wasn't going to be allowed to stand. And I frankly have to say, I never had a chance before a television audience to say it before, we didn't publish that book for our own benefit because we didn't derive any benefit from that book. I mean, we felt that everybody should have an equal opportunity to look at the scrolls, amateur and professional alike, professional from any institution, amateur from any institution, from your church, from any other church. It didn't matter. And we felt the only way to level the playing field, and I'll explain this to you in a moment, the only way to level the playing field was to publish all the pictures for everybody to use. Let's have a level playing field, and then we can get proper interpretation of the scrolls. Let me just explain that. What is meant by proper interpretation of the scrolls? The establishment team, this is the problem, not so much censorship or church doctrine or whatever. The establishment team were all conservative, church-oriented people of a church mindset, of an Orthodox Christian mindset. They felt the scrolls were alien to them. So in their theories, they distanced the scroll from the origins of Christianity as far as possible. Therefore, when the copper scroll came in, and a very famous article in the 1950s by Edmund Wilson came in the New Yorker, who was a communist fellow traveler, on the relation of the Dead Sea Scrolls to early Christianity, and John Allegro's theories also, this caused great consternation. And it was at this point that the veil of secrecy came down. When the Israelis conquered the scrolls, or East Jerusalem in the late 60s, they inadvertently furthered the monopoly because they reaffirmed the previous monopoly in control of the scrolls because they didn't understand all these complexities. But the final problem was that the people controlling the scrolls were putting their interpretations on these scrolls too. I put this in succinctly in that book you have there, Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered. I said that control of the unpublished manuscripts meant control of the field, and that's what the problem was.
Professor Eisenman, my understanding of the situation was that this book, a facsimile edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, was a publication of scrolls never before seen by the public. These scrolls were the custody of that team, and somehow you got possession of photographic copies of all of these scrolls. This whole book, for the viewers...
That's 2 volumes. It's not just one. There's 1,800 plates.
Yeah, this is volume 1.
And there's another volume.
As I flick through the
Published
pages,
by the Biblical Archaeology Society in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
There's a case already still going on in the Israeli Supreme Court about that publication.
Well, my understanding was that you somehow were sent copies of photographs of unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls, never before released by the public. And
Released
then,
to the public, yeah.
And then, if you don't mind my saying this, this is my own opinion, so it's not you bragging, you courageously published this edition of these unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls so that other scholars and the public could actually see for the first time Dead Sea Scrolls that had been withheld by that team for 40, 50 years. Well, I think that was a very brave thing for you to do, but what I want to know is...
Maybe it was braver for the people who gave it to us, but,
well, that's what I want to know.
But they're not identified.
How the heck did you get into your possession photographs of unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, I'm the only one who knows the answer to that, and I've never revealed the answer to that to anyone except the people who cooperated with me on that. Not even the editor of the Biblical Archaeological Review, Herschel Shanks, the final publisher of that book. That's an interesting story, too, the publication of that, because he wasn't the first publisher. This was published, if you know the chronology, in November of 1991. So that was when... And I said the only way to break the monopoly, and I mean not just research, but interpretation of the scrolls, was to publish everything. You have to cut through the Gordian knot. This book was scheduled for publication in April of that year by a different European publisher, a very famous European publisher, who 10 days before publication date pulled out because of pressure that was brought to bear. Whether it was because of the scrolls, they deny it was because of the scrolls, or some other reason, whatever the reason, they pulled out. and I don't know what their reasons were, but they pulled out 10 days before publication date. We had all the scrolls a year before. We had everything ready to go. And they pulled out for various reasons that have never been revealed, and I don't satisfactorily know myself whether it was pressure or something else, but they pulled out, leaving us high and dry without a publisher. It was then that the Huntington Library stepped in. The Huntington Library caught wind of this, and it was not until June, July, and August that the Huntington Library got involved in their decision to open up its archive. So strictly speaking, the Huntington Library actually opened up its archives. I was the consultant to the Huntington Library in San Marino on its decision to go public with these scrolls. They talked to me very seriously about the repercussions. And I explained to them that there wouldn't be any repercussions except from the Israeli government. And they explained why. Well, because I said the Israeli scholars would feel that they were just getting into it now, and they would want control of the scrolls themselves, and they would feel aggrieved that you're opening this up to the general public again. You would be back to square one, and which is exactly what happened. But I have to say, the Huntington Library, I got a call from the Huntington Library in September of 1991 saying it's go, and they went. But I have to say that the Huntington Library never really showed the scrolls to anyone, even though they said they were opening their archives until the next year. Nobody ever got up to the Huntington Library until 1992. We published this book in 1991, so everyone could see everything. So the Huntington Library, though they said that they opened their archives, it was only, to a certain extent, a shadow play. I didn't even go and look at the Huntington Library, although I was up there with them and looked at the material, but no one did research. No one was allowed to look at anything until 1992. Now, so actually this book was the first book that was shown.
Now, am I correct that when you released...
This is the second publication, because this publisher took it up after the first publication in April had been basically vetoed by somebody.
Am I correct that when you went ahead and released to the public these previously withheld Dead Sea Scrolls, that the team, the official team that has control of the Dead Sea Scrolls to this day, weren't at all pleased and in fact engaged in lawsuits?
No, that isn't true.
Okay, who did the lawsuit that you're referring to?
It's ongoing, so I really don't want to talk about that. The lawsuit is still going on, but the law school suit was directed by and these people are extremely sensitive. There are libel suits that are possible. There are all kinds of things like that. So one has to be extremely careful about how one expresses oneself in things where there are very touchy, trigger-happy, legal-minded people ready to jump at the least thing. So you have to excuse me if I don't jump to general expressions. I have to be very, very precise.
I think you've been very courageous.
The person, I have to be very careful. You just can't jump off the plug on these things. Because the least thing you say, they're waiting to trip you up. Mm-hmm. And you can't be imprecise either. One of my colleagues who worked with me on the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered found that out to his chagrin, that you can't be imprecise. My colleague had a lot of troubles in that regard. But the point was that there was a scholar, a disgruntled scholar in Israel, who sued the publisher of this facsimile edition because of something he saw in the publisher's foreword. It had nothing to do with the publication of the plates as such, not the suit that is going on. So no, nobody sued over that, though there may have been a motive of that kind in someone's mind somewhere. But that scholar denies that was his motive. He was just worried about his work appearing in not our book. He didn't ever publish over the publication of the pictures over something in the publisher's foreword. But I'd like to get away from this subject. This is a minefield.
Yes.
And the people, and also the people who are responsible for giving the pictures have not yet been identified. And a lot of people like to know who they are, and I haven't revealed that.
And the fact is that nowadays, a scholar such as yourself, who takes the courageous action that you did for the benefit of the public,
if I did, I hope I did. Yeah. That was my motive. Some people would think it was otherwise, but I think, as far as I'm aware, that was my motive.
Yeah, and it certainly did benefit the public, because we now can read Dead Sea Scrolls that we couldn't read before. But
and there's no academic mafia or no academic monopoly that can tell you what these things mean without you looking at it yourself and deciding whether you agree with that.
We can read it ourselves. Right, we just have to study Hebrew for it.
Right. Well, you can still look up points.
But nevertheless, you know, 1,500 years ago, a scholar like yourself would have to watch out, or he could actually get tied to a stake.
Oh, you get burned. Yes, a lot of people were burned over these issues, terribly.
And nowadays, it's more that you have to watch out for lawsuits and everything.
Let me tell you something, David, on that point.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't even blanch about the burnings that occurred of good, decent people for a 500-year period, from about 1,000 to about 16. People were still being burned in 1600s anyway. You know, I'm reading recently about English martyrs who were burned. Their hands were actually still quivering in the fires as they were dying, and things like this, just for saying the smallest thing about their beliefs. And then these people who are responsible for that kind of activity don't even blanch with apologies today for often, in fact, trying to limit free speech at the present time. And other people support that activity, and we still haven't heard an apology for all these horrendous things that were done in the last 600, 700 years, and the terrible suffering that people went through. Can you imagine what it was like to be burned because you thought something? I mean, how atrocious that could be.
Well, those who are regular viewers of this TV show can vouch for the fact that 1,500 years ago, I'd have been one of the first guys tied to the stake. So nowadays, I'm lucky because all that happens is I get a few angry letters from fundamentalists and such. But before totally leaving this topic, I do want to alert the viewers to the book that followed the facsimile edition, a book by yourself and Michael Wise called The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the primary difference between this book and the facsimile edition that we were looking at is that the facsimile edition was simply photographs of the scrolls themselves, so that anybody that wanted to look at them, study them, and interpret them for themselves could do so. This book, The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, you actually, along with Dr. Wise, translate them and provide interpretation.
Well, the rationale behind that book was, look, we said, look, we've got these pictures, we're making them all public, we're not trying to make any academic capital out of them, but we had the thrill of seeing our translation and our interpretation. If you open that up, you'll see actually there's Hebrew text in there. Now, no previous Dead Sea Scroll compilation, actually Hebrew transcriptions, if you look further along in this volume, you'll see that we would give a Hebrew transcription, and then we would give a translation, and then we would give an interpretation. No previous volume ever thought the public was worthy of seeing the actual Hebrew text so that they could take the actual translation and go and see if we were lying to them. No previous volume, and now a lot of them do it. But previously, no one ever put the Hebrew on for the general public. For scholars, yes, but not for the general public. Now, as you see, the Israeli government likes to follow in the tracks of others. They're doing that in their official things, but no one did that before. So that was the benefit of that book. But the rationale behind that book was, we said, look, we never got a chance to get a book out there first. So we picked what we consider the 50 most interesting, there are a lot of interesting materials, from the previously unpublished corpus and rushed out there with this volume. So for the first time, the public was treated to an opposition point of view in terms of interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And a lot of people's reaction to that was electric, because for always they'd had the establishment theorizing about these scrolls. And you see, that proves the theory that I put out here before. Control of the unpublished manuscripts meant control of the field. If you could get out there first with your interpretation, rather than the establishment getting its interpretation out there, people were going to listen to you and take you seriously, and that's what they've done. That book has been taken extremely seriously by a lot of people.
Well, Dr. Eisenman, as I read this book, I was struck by the language, how profoundly Christian some of the language is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. As a matter of fact, on the back cover of the book, we read here, the authors speak of a Messiah and the resurrection of the dead. They allude not only to doctrines we now recognize as Christian, but also, and it goes on and on. But when I read this book, I said to myself, no wonder these scrolls have been withheld for over 40 years. There's some interesting material in here. They tried to say that this was not significant stuff, But it struck me as extremely significant.
Well, again, you're giving the editorial committee too much credit. I'm not sure the editorial committee ever understood that this was very Christian stuff. So I'm not sure that was the reason behind the withholding or so-called withholding. I'm not sure they even withheld it. They claimed they were seriously working on the scrolls in a scholarly manner, which is probably true. But they, as I said, a philologist, I said in my introduction, has a different interest than a historian. A historian has to have all the materials at his or her disposal. He or she can't wait a whole lifetime while the philologist labors on what are labors of love to get a certain manuscript down to the precise cross T and cross X's. We need all the data out there. The philologists could go on with their research, but we couldn't wait. So I'm not sure that those people knew what you're saying. But the key you're missing here is, again, because of their hidebound mindset, because of anyone who in the inner circle of scroll studies had to have the same mindset. Father DeVoe brooked no differences of opinion on the meaning of the scrolls. That's why John Allegro went the way of all flesh, because they could only see one interpretation. This didn't look like Christianity to them. Father Milik, in his book, 10 Years of Discovery in the Judean Desert, says, this group looks very much like Christians, only they don't have a developed doctrine of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Yes, but that's because Christians in Palestine didn't have a developed doctrine of their Lord and Savior.
How could they? That came centuries later.
Right. So that's what I mean. They all had this single mindset, and it didn't look like that. What I tried to focus on in my work, and that is in this work here, this other work, is to show how much Christian-type thinking is in the scrolls, but totally unrecognizable to us because, in fact, we're not familiar with the more aggressive, militant form of messianic thinking that you have in the scrolls.
I'd like to alert our viewers to the book that Professor Eisenman's now referring to, his book, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And any of you watching this show who would actually like to study the relationship between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the first Christians should pick up this book.
Yeah, that was 1996 from Element Press in Massachusetts. That's available, Element Press in Rockport, Massachusetts. It's not widely known that that's out, but that's a collection of essays which shows how Christian these materials really are, but unrecognizably so because it's a more militant, aggressive, apocalyptic Christianity.
We might even say that book is a perfect lead-in to your newest book, that book being 1996. Your new book, and I do want to shift gears now and get into the new book.
That's the main book.
Is called James, the Brother of Jesus. And I'd like to point out that this volume is over 1,000 pages. The subtitle is The Key of Unlocking the Secrets of Early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the title, James, the Brother of Jesus, is going to take some viewers aback because it's not even widely recognized that Jesus had a brother.
That's right.
And it's not at all recognized that James, Jesus' brother, was a central figure to early Christianity. So what I'd like you to do now is shift gears and get into this book.
Right.
What was the role of James in early Christianity? And first of all, can you provide some names of some source materials that actually mention James? How do you know Jesus had a brother named James?
There you go again, David. You're going to make me write the whole book for you on one foot here. Look, first I want to say that you said there's 1,075 pages or so in that book. It is true, but the publishers had us cut 500 pages out, so your public might have been in for a worse shock if it was in toto. What we did in this book is that we wanted the arguments on this book to stand regardless of disputes over the chronology of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We wanted this book to stand on the early church documents, the New Testament, the letters of Paul, the Gospels, the book of Acts, and all the early church fathers, what we call the Gnostic text from Nag Hammadi, Josephus, Syriac texts, apocryphal texts from further east, and other early church materials. We wanted this book to be done in a meticulous delineation of those materials without the confusing arguments over the scrolls. Because what has happened in the scroll research is this. Scholars now, basically the consensus has reformed in the scrolls. What's happened is now you just have a wider consensus. A lot more people have been brought in, but basically they're all speaking in the same language again, because nobody from the opposition framework has ever been brought into the official editing process of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're back to a situation where the scrolls, to work off the scrolls is once again almost useless, because the establishment has recovered control of the interpretation of the scrolls, and they're saying, the scrolls don't really tell us too much about early Christianity when we think they tell us a lot. So we wanted this book to be only judged on the New Testament sources. Therefore, we cut 500 pages out, which is going to come out in a second volume later on. It's already written. It's ready to go. A second volume that will firm up the relationship of James to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this one is just the problem of James, the brother of Jesus. Now, you asked...
If I can pause you for just one moment, my understanding from reading some newspaper stories about this book is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because newspaper stories aren't always accurate, but my...
Newspapers are newspapers.
My understanding from the newspaper story that I read was that you were actually offered what I would consider extremely large amount of upfront money for this book, and turned it down so that you could keep the editorial process in your hands, and that if you hadn't done that, there was the distinct possibility that this book would have been edited down to perhaps half of its existing size.
The original publishers wanted a book of 350 pages. And actually, don't want to get into names here, but they actually put an editor on me who I later discovered had, well, it was from I think, from what it looked like, I don't want to be imprecise here, Jesuit background.
And the Jesuits, for our viewers, that is a Catholic order.
Well, no, I don't want to get into any sort of relationships. I'm just saying that it was impossible for me to work under those circumstances, to have that kind of activity in the cutting of my book. And they, yes, had offered me up front a substantial amount of money, which I gave back totally, over $50,000, which I gave back in order to come out from under that editorial setup. I'll tell you more about that later, because it will come into our discussion of the reception of this book. So yes, I held out for editorial control and went to a different publisher, Viking Penguin, who gave me editorial control, and I took no money from them. So all money that I received on this book, I gave back in order that I could have editorial control, so that we would get an uncut version that would be 1,000 pages of full of the data that people need to approach this subject, not 350 pages.
And before you get into describing the content of the book and James's role in early Christianity, what I want to tell the viewers is that I've read this book, and it is so chock full of information that has never been published before. There's important stuff in here. If this were cut down from the 1,000 pages that now it is to the 350 pages, we would be losing about 700 pages of revolutionary information. And I want to ask the viewers, how many of you would have had the courage to turn down $50,000 of upfront money?
More than that.
More than $50,000 of upfront money in order to assure that your book would not be cut.
Give it back.
But it would be quite a challenge to turn down $50,000.
You have to give it all back, otherwise they control you. And it turns out any money you get up front is actually negative, because it means editorial control goes over to someone else. And people have to realize that if they're serious writers. If you want to keep control of something, you have to take no money for it.
Well, nevertheless, and this is my statement, not yours, I am a theist. I believe in God, and I have to say that whatever the controlling wisdom power of the universe is, that power, we'll call it she for the sake of some of our viewers, that power couldn't have picked a better person to put these unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls and this sort of early Christian information, to put this information into your hands, because you seem to be a man who's courageous and can't be bought. You don't have to...
I don't want to say I can't. Anyone can be bought, I suppose, in the end, but I had a funny mother. My mother taught me not to value money much, and I never have.
Well, amen. Why don't you get a bit into the content of James, the brother of Jesus? Jesus had a brother?
Okay, that really comes down to the interesting material, right? Most people don't even know Jesus had a brother. But as I've mentioned to you, this book is based on the original sources, and we want to go always to the original sources to verify whatever we said. Recently, there was a review done in the New York Times of this book, which sledgehammered this book, because it was done by someone from a religious mindset who was teaching at a parochial university and was trained in a parochial environment.
And you might not want to say it. You've been very polite tonight.
I'm trying not to say these things.
I'm the controversial host of this show, and I'm going to say that the person you're describing was, again, Jesuit trained. We're talking about another Catholic.
Right. Well, forget the Catholic. Jesuit is important. Leave it at that. We don't want to hurt anyone's feelings from any religious group, because there are very good Jesuits out there. There are very good Catholics out there. There's very good everyone out there. The main thing is to have a free mind. We don't care what a person's religious background is, as long as they're free. You said that at the beginning of your program. That's how I see it. When you start getting into labeling people Catholic, Jew, Protestant, you are maybe sometimes alienating a lot of very good, decent people out there. People are sensitive about these labels. I feel the key to anyone is whether they want to get their teeth into something, whether they're free-thinking, and whether they want to go ahead and use their own brain. If they're under authority, then obviously we can't speak.
Nevertheless, but we have to admit that it seems that at every point of the process of from the initial discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls on through and in your own life journey, it seems to be that the institution, not the dear, wonderful people that I know and that you know that are Catholic, but the mainline religious institutions, and the Catholic Church just happens to be a giant one, and so has a lot of influence, but mainline religious institutions have not been being very helpful in the release of this information. And I assert that, it is at least in part because it's controversial.
I disagree with the way you put it, because I don't want to, again, Catholic bashing, I don't want to get into that at all. That is wrong, that is bad, it's negative. Any kind of bashing is bad. I'm worried about people under authority. If a person is under authority, whatever that authority, whether it's Islamic, whether it's Jewish, whether it's any religious authority, that person is not going to free. A person has to be able, if we're going to be in the same ballpark, if we're going to be on the same table, if we're going to be in the same universe, we have to have free minds, and that's what our Declaration of Independence said, that's what Thomas Jefferson said, and that's all we ask. And so I don't care what the background of a given person is, the key is not to be under authority, but to be able to use your own brain.
Okay. Well, let's get into the content of this book again. So
let me go back to James. Right,
James, Jesus had a brother. Tell us about that.
Yes. Oh, Jesus in the Scripture itself. So that we'd like to go back to the Scripture. I was saying this individual involved, just to get back to that one subject, pounded us for going to the original sources, saying we don't pay attention to the secondary literature. No, we want to go to the original sources, and that's where you find the material about James. It turns out that in the Gospels, as we have them, whether reliable or not, Jesus has 4 brothers, and that is in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they are named or enumerated. They are James, Simon, Jude, and Josie. He also has at least one sister, according to the Gospels themselves. So in the Gospels, there's no doubt that Jesus has brothers. Now, the Gospels don't say they're half-brothers. They don't say they're cousins. They don't say that these are, brothers by a different mother. They just say unashamedly, unabashedly, these are Jesus' brothers. Paul, in his letters, again in the New Testament, talks about the brothers of Jesus. In the letter to the Galatians, he talks about James, the brother of the Lord. And in the 1 Corinthians document, he refers to the brothers of Jesus a second time. So Paul knows the brothers of Jesus. And finally, the book of Acts. The book of Acts talks extensively about someone it calls James. Now, most people think, this is James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee. That would be true, and even some of the reviewers of my book make this error, saying, I've confused these Jameses. No, the book of Acts has confused these James. It would be true this was James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, if that person, according to Acts, hadn't been removed in chapter 12. But as soon as he's removed, another James jumps in to take his place. In the same chapter 12, we're introduced to a second James. Rather, we're not introduced, but from other sources, as you know them, early church sources, Eusebius, Epiphanius, the Pseudo-Clementines that we'll talk about, we know that this is James, the brother of Jesus. And Acts starts talking about him in chapter 12, in chapter 15, in chapter 21, etc. And we know from the references there that he is the leader of the early church.
You were referencing, besides New Testament books, several ancient historical descriptions of James. In those ancient descriptions, James isn't only described as a brother of Jesus, but he's described as the head of the Christian church. Wasn't called Christian at that point in time, but James isn't just any brother of Jesus. He's actually Jesus's successor in some sort of a sense. Is he not in those early descriptions?
Absolutely, and it is very clear. That's what we worry about in the book of Acts. A lot of the focus on this James, the brother of Jesus books, as I think I've told you privately, is on the book of Acts, because as I've said over and over again in much of my work and on programs like this, Acts is the battleground. Acts is where the battle has to be joined, because Acts is the picture of the early history of the church according to the Orthodox sources that compiled the New Testament as we have it. But as you know, and as others watching this program also probably know, there are heterodox sources that give a very different picture. And what I try to do in this book, in many points, is to evaluate these sources and see where we have the authentic picture and where we have perhaps some fudging, rewriting, or even purposeful fictionalization going on. There is a statement in one of the documents that we both mentioned, the pseudo-Clementine literature. Pseudo because it's supposed to be in the name of a person called Clement, and the church as we know it thought that these were false writings, whereas their writings were true. Whereas you and I would put all the little writings on the table, let the public judge for itself which is false, which is true. But there's a statement in the pseudo-Clementines attributed to Jesus where Jesus says, "Be like good money changers, able to tell false coin from true." And I think that's what we want our audiences to do, and that's why we have all this data, to be able to tell false coin from true, and that's where the book of Acts is the battleground.
Your book is a fascinating book, and one of the chapters is actually titled "The Vegetarianism of James," and the viewers of this show are quite aware that one of my own main interests is in the early vegetarian teachings of primitive Christianity. I've asserted on this show numerous times that the earliest Christian movement was vegetarian, and these ancient sources that you've cited that are describing Jesus as having this brother James, and James as the head of the church after him, when they describe James, they describe him as a vegetarian. There's many other early Christian sources that describe this early vegetarian form of Christianity, calling them the Ebionites, the Nazarenes. Much of their terminology is similar to what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They seem to be an outgrowth of this Judaic Essene movement. But the thing that had caused me a bit of consternation is that even though the source materials were describing Jesus as having a brother James in charge of the church after Jesus' crucifixion, and James was a vegetarian, and then the Clementine manuscript describing Peter as a vegetarian, and Acts of Thomas describing Thomas as a vegetarian, and so many sources on vegetarianism, mainline scholarship has failed, I believe, to take adequate note of that, and that's why I was very pleased to see your book, James, the Brother of Jesus, actually have a chapter on the vegetarianism of James. And so I want to ask you a question. You're not related to my church. You're a renowned scholar. Would you agree with my assertion that it seems that James, the brother of Jesus, was a vegetarian, and that there was some sort of a strain of Jamesian Christianity that was indeed vegetarian?
Well, absolutely, you're right there. Certainly all the sources tell us these are extra-biblical sources primarily, but also reading between the lines of Paul, you can see that James, because Paul, as it turns out, seems to be James's arch nemesis or arch enemy, that you can see that Paul, in fact, that James is a vegetarian. Whether I'm a renowned scholar or not, even your other people, that's a matter of opinion, but anybody, and that's why we put the data out there, can see this. Yes, we have here in this book, as it starts off, we have a lot of background material, source material, and so on. We start off with one chapter of the first appearance of James in Acts. We go into the picture of James in Paul's letters. We go into the election of James to succeed his brother, and then we get into James's Nazaritism, and then his Rechabitism, his vegetarianism and abstention from blood and so on, and his clothing, which is similar to your clothing habits, linen and his bathing habits. So we go into all that kind of material, but it is true that from early church sources, they primarily tell us that James was a vegetarian. But not only James. These sources tell us, well, John the Baptist, regardless of the New Testament picture we get of eating locusts, which I don't think is accurate, I think John the Baptist is in the same mold, vegetarian, bathing sort of individual. The Pseudo-Clementine literature, as I told you, it's not a literature that is orthodox. It's actually an opposition Acts. It is the Acts written in the East against the powers of the Western Church. Acts, which presents a different Peter, a different James, same Paul, but a different Peter and a different James. In Acts we can say Peter is Paulinized. There's an episode in Acts where Peter gets a vision of a tablecloth coming down from heaven with, if you know Jewish dietary regulations, all kinds of forbidden food on it. Lobster, shrimp, I suppose, crabs and so on, snails, snakes. And a voice cries out from heaven saying, "Eat, Peter, eat." And Peter in this episode in the book of Acts says, "No, I have never eaten any unclean thing." That's probably authentic, that Peter had never eaten any unclean thing. It's the vision of the tablecloth that Paulinizes him. And after the voice cries out 3 times, by the way, the fact that Peter doesn't know that he can eat forbidden foods means that Jesus never taught it, even according to Acts. So Acts trips itself up there by trying to Paulinize its Peter. It inadvertently tells us the picture of Jesus we have in these scripture can't be authentic. Otherwise, why would Peter need such a vision? But that being aside, Peter then cries out, the voice cries out, "Eat, Peter, eat," 3 times, and Peter says finally, "I have now learned not to call anything unclean or profane, and not to call any man unclean." And then the Roman centurion comes, sending his servant, so that Peter is prepared to visit his household. But the Pseudo-Clementines give us a totally different Peter. That Peter does not eat forbidden foods, does keep away from all unclean things, is a vegetarian, is a daily bather, rises at the sun before dawn and prays. And what a beautiful Peter that is. To me, the information in the Pseudo-Clementines is 10 times more interesting and 100 times more beautiful than the Peter we get in Scripture. Because the Peter in our Scripture, if you look really carefully, we don't have any picture of him at all. He hardly does anything except argue with Jews, and basically what comes out of his mouth is anti-Semitic invective. And it's not a very, very pretty Peter at all. The Peter in the Pseudo-Clementines is absolutely lovely. The only problem is he's not Paulinized, he's Jamesian.
You're hitting on a really significant point. I've asserted in previous shows, and we're asserting tonight, that there was an earliest form of Christianity, this Essene, Ebionite, Nazarene Christianity, which was vegetarian, which was headed by James after the death of Jesus, that there's some early literature, the Clementines and Gospel of the Hebrews, other manuscripts that this group had, which was a sort of a vegetarian form of early Christianity. Obviously, the fact that Christianity did not continue to be vegetarian means that something happened. And my research has pointed to Paul as being the something that happened, and you just referred to Paul as being pictured in this Essene Christian literature, the Clementines, etc., as being the arch nemesis of Peter and James. Right. What can you tell us about that? I mean, Paul is considered by most people as the great hero of Christianity, but in this early Essene Christian literature, he's the arch enemy.
He's the arch enemy. He's the Antichrist incarnate. I think that's the way he was viewed he was viewed that way in Palestine, absolutely, that Paul was viewed as the Antichrist. I think there's a fairly wide consensus developing around the world now. It's not just my book, but Ann Wilson's book on Paul and some other books coming out, the Bajent Lee type books and so on, that are beginning to make it clear, the Chaim Maccoby books, that Paul is the originator of the Western form of Christianity as we know it, Paul and his associates. We don't want to say it's all Paul, but basically it's a Pauline view. But that is overseas Christianity in the West, the one that we're familiar with. And these documents that we have, they're all written in Greek. They come down through a Greek retention system, a Greek redaction system. Otherwise, they'd have been written in Syriac, Hebrew, or some other language. They're written in Greek, and they're Greek documents written by Greek for people from a Greco-Roman point of view. But that does not accurately reflect what was going on in Palestine. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so frightening to some and so exciting to others, because here for the first time, almost like a time capsule, we have documents from the time of Christ, as I said, a little before, a little after, doesn't really matter, don't want to get into the chronological problems, that show us what was going on in Palestine through the eyes of native literature. And this is terribly exciting, terribly explosive, and wonderful. And also we have all this other literature represented by the Pseudo-Clementines, apocryphal Gospels, reading in between the lines of Paul, early church literature to some extent, that is being conserved from Eastern writers that give us a completely other form of Christianity. And it's quite clear that the Christianity that we know in Palestine and this other form was led by James, the brother of not John, who I don't even think existed, and that's an overwrite. That's a Western Christian overwrite in my view, to write the other James out and to marginalize him and make him into a less. We even have a character, James the Less, a lesser being. James was the leader of the early Christian church and in Palestine for all groups east, all groups from Palestine east. It's only in the west that we get the Paulinized tradition. So of course, our Christians are going to be familiar with the Western materials. We're beginning to show them there's another strand, backed up by the scrolls, backed up by a lot of groups that you represent, the Essene groups, the Ebionite groups, a lot of other groups that were functioning over there that actually probably are the earliest form of Christianity and the most authentic strand.
You've documented so well in the 1,000-page new book, James the Brother of Jesus, how Paul, in his epistles, which is simply a word which means letters, in the New Testament, actually was attacking James and the leadership of the Christian movement. It's ironic that the people that Paul was attacking, he refers to as the old apostles. He's referring to not only James...
Super apostles, he calls them. Super apostles.
In a negative, condescending manner.
Oh, yes, condescending.
He's referring...
Pillars, so-called pillars.
He's referring to people that were personally trained by Jesus. He's brushing them aside and asserting himself. And isn't
his own visionary experience.
And isn't it true that Paul came later and never actually met Jesus?
Well, that's the point. If you look at that's what we take a lot of time analyzing, because most people don't realize this. They haven't read the things for themselves. Most people are under authority. Most people have been taught things either in catechism classes or in other religious instructions and take things second, third hand, say that I'm not intelligent enough or I'm not sophisticated enough or I don't have a big enough brain to approach these problems myself. If there was something in it, we'd have already heard of it, and don't realize that that isn't the case at all. That we haven't heard about these things because we didn't have the scrolls previously, and up till this 18th century, we were still being burned at the stake. We didn't have an American Constitution to protect us. And you'll get into your Albigensians, who were all wiped out earlier because they were vegetarians. But absolutely true that there is the data there in the documents when read carefully in Paul's letter that Paul is insulting the leadership of the church. In Galatians, he calls them so-called pillars, not that their importance means anything to me. In Corinthians, he speaks about their being puffed up. Then he speaks that they have weak consciences because they won't eat things sacrificed to idols. In the book of Acts, not eating things sacrificed to idols is the basis of James's, in chapter 20, in chapter 15 and chapter 21, James's instructions to oversee communities. So we can tell that Paul is heaping abuse on the Jamesian leadership.
Isn't he even mocking Jamesians' vegetarianism?
Absolutely. In Romans, he says some of these people are so weak that his conscience for him is a euphemism for observing the law, that the law is a crutch so that they're weak. And some, he says, are so weak that they will eat only vegetables. Well, nowadays, we think people who eat vegetables are strong, who only eat vegetables are strong. Yeah. They're resisting the temptation of meat. Paul, as he does almost everything else, turns everything on its ear. Somersaults everything for the benefit, in my view, and I outline it very carefully in all my books, and not only this one, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, for the benefit of the Greco-Roman world that he represented. It turns it all on their ear and reversed it, and he calls these people weak for being vegetarians. And he means James, Peter, and all the other so-called Jewish apostles of the
who
early
were
church.
actually trained by Jesus and so should know Jesus' mind.
I
Now,
can't speak about Jesus because the documents we have about Jesus are so overwritten that I can only speak about James. As I've said in my book, once you found the historical James, you found the historical Jesus.
That's one of the most powerful points you make in your book, and that is that when James and the other people trained by Jesus, when we have these clear descriptions of their vegetarianism and the other practices, we know, and you assert in your book, that once you've discovered the historical James, you've discovered the historical Jesus.
And at the end of the book, I actually say, I think it's worth reading out, I think, to your listening audience, because I probably couldn't say it better myself now, and people usually read these things at book reading, so I think I can. The last paragraph of the book says something like this: "It is these things that the Dead Sea Scrolls help put in sharp relief. Without the scrolls, we would only have suspected them because of the mutually contradictory information in the New Testament and early church documents. With the scrolls, for use as control, we get an entirely different picture of events in Palestine than either the New Testament or the documents of Rabbinic Judaism, now normative Judaism, provide. Whether James is to be identified with the righteous teacher of the Dead Sea Scrolls or simply a parallel successor is not the point. The scrolls allow us to approach the messianic community of James with about as much precision as we are likely to have from any other source. One hopes that the arguments put forth in this book will at least lift some of the purposeful misrepresentation and cloud of unknowing surrounding these issues. Once James has been rescued from the oblivion into which he was cast, abetted by one of the most successful rewrite enterprises ever accomplished, the book of Acts, and one of the most fantastic, it is necessary to deal with the new constellation of facts, the reality of his being occasions, James's being, that is. It will also no longer be possible, and this is the key point I'm trying to make, building up to it, to avoid, through endless scholarly debate and other evasion syndromes, the obvious solution to the problem of the historical Jesus, the question of his actual physical existence as such aside, the answer to which is simple: who and whatever James was, so was Jesus."
Well,
and I think that's how we end the book. And I think that's
amen and hallelujah, Professor Eisenman. Before leaving the topic of Paul, I want to just touch on one more thing. Let me clue the viewers into this book. It's titled The Dead Sea Scroll Deception. And this book, although it was not authored by Professor Eisenman, it was authored by Michael Bajent and Richard Lee. The whole book is primarily based on the research of Professor Eisenman. There is a chapter in this book titled Paul, Roman Agent or Informer. And so the last thing I want to do with Paul, Professor Eisenman, is simply look for a moment at motive. And I know you really, really get into this in your book, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. I would commend this to the viewers, but let's touch on it here, is if in fact Paul subverted this early Christian movement throughout the vegetarianism, changed a lot of things.
Yeah, Paul said, all things are lawful, all things are permitted me, and eat everything in the butcher shops, eat everything in the marketplace, and don't raise questions of conscience.
Now, if Paul indeed subverted this early Christian Ebionite movement of Jesus and James, the question is, why? Was it simply, his own philosophy he wanted to boldly assert and it happened to be different? Or did he, in fact, like this book asserts, have some sort of ties with the elites of Rome? Or do you think he was some sort of species of Roman agent?
Well, that's the way they put ideas, that they basically ripped off of an article we have in this book called, which was delivered to the Society of Biblical Literature in 1984, called Paul as Herodian. Paul as Herodian. You might show that there. Which the Bajent and Lee had available to them, which had not previously been printed. So my view of Paul is laid out in that book, and they picked it up in their Dead Sea Scrolls Deception and used their own language. I do believe that Paul had a Roman citizenship. I think I'm the first one that showed that he probably had relations to the Herodian family, because in Romans, in chapter 16, if your audience looked at that chapter, he sends greeting to his kinsman Herodian, H-E-R-O-D-I-O-N. He says, my relative. And Herodian in Greek is the littlest Herod, the smallest or the youngest Herod. In other words, Paul has a kinsman called the littlest Herod. I already suspected that he was Herodian long before one of my students actually pointed that out to me. It wasn't my idea. A student of mine in the class pointed that out to me. But yes, there is, how did he get his Roman citizenship? That was not an easy thing to come by. He's on, even in the book of Acts, extremely easy relations with Herodian kings, Agrippa, Bernice, his paramour, sister. They were considered to be in an incestuous relationship. They appear in Acts 26 and 27. Felix, the most brutal governor in Palestine after Pontius Pilate. Josephus says Felix crucified so many people, there wasn't enough room for the crucifixions, nor enough wood for the crosses. Felix's paramour, Drusilla, the sister of Agrippa I. All this we cover in the book. So Paul's on easy terms, even in Acts, with these people. He has an entree into the highest circles. In the letter to the Philippians, Paul sends greetings to the household of Nero. He sends Epaphroditus. We cover Epaphroditus in this book, who is Josephus' publisher, who was Nero's secretary for Greek letters. He sends greetings to people in the household of Nero. So he's got very high relations. I don't know. If he went to Rome and was supposed to have been executed and wasn't, there's only one way that he could have survived such a trip if in some sense he went into service of some kind. The Bajan Lee people speak of that as being an agent or a double agent or an informer, etc., etc., etc. I think in some way Paul was deeply compromised with the Roman authorities.
And just briefly...
which is Roman citizenship would imply. Can you imagine Jesus, when he's arrested, pulling out his Roman passport and saying, "Do you arrest Roman citizens?"
Just briefly, am I correct, from my reading of the Clementine manuscript that we've been discussing, that there seems to be a description of Paul attempting to kill James, the brother of Jesus?
Oh, absolutely. That's true, too. Yes. We forgot that, didn't we? In the early career of Paul, when the Acts admits that he's an enemy of the early church, Paul even admits in Galatians that he persecuted the church unto death. I show in my book that there's very strange things going on in the execution of John the Baptist. But also in the Pseudo-Clementines, the recognitions picture Paul as leading an actual physical assault on James and throwing him down the steps. The reason we didn't cover it here was because even the Pseudo-Clementines admit that that didn't cause James's death, but the detail is very, very precise. James broke one or both of his legs, because when later James sends Peter off on his first missionary journey, all this would strike your audience as bizarre, because I've never heard any of it. It's all in the Pseudo-Clementine literature that comes from the 2nd and 3rd century, almost as old as our book of Acts is supposed to be. When James sends Peter off on his first missionary journey, Peter says he's still limping on one foot from the fall he took after Paul attacked him in the temple. Yes. That's incredible detail, and that's down in Jericho, where our Dead Sea Scrolls were more or less found. So, you know, there's a lot of material pointing to an actual physical assault by Paul on James in the early career, and there is other material pointing to the fact that Paul had a hand, early church admits this, in the death of early Christians. I would go so far as to say that it may have been John the Baptist as well, because I'll tell you why the John the Baptist thing is very strange. Paul in Acts is always anxious to cover up all of this material. Do you know the episode I'm talking about, a famous episode when Paul is let down the wall of Damascus in a basket? Acts says, and Acts is always secondary to Paul's own first-person testimony. Your audience should bear that in mind. When there's a conflict between Acts and Paul's own testimony, which there often is, it's Paul's own testimony that should be preferred. Acts says Paul was escaping down the walls of Damascus to escape from the Jews who wanted to kill him. But Paul in 2 Corinthians says, I escaped down the walls of Damascus in a basket to escape from the representatives of King Aretas. King Aretas was an Arab king in Transjordan, and King Aretas' people were taking vengeance for the death of John the Baptist. So if Paul was an Herodian involved with people like the people who killed John the Baptist, it would make sense that Paul was escaping from the representatives of King Aretas. Acts changes that into anti-Semitism, which is my problem with Acts. It is always moving over into the area of anti-Semitism, And if one wants to know why we have so much anti-Semitism in the Western world, a good place to begin to look for it is in the book of Acts. So the movement you represent actually does a healing process on this, because you remove all of this, what I would consider material unworthy of Christianity, from the table. And you go over to a much more gentle, soft, docile, honest brand of Christian love and charity.
Dr. Eisenman, I want to thank you for being with us tonight. I want to again affirm to our readers that if you really want a thorough, well-documented study of early Christianity, as a matter of fact, there are certain words that most of you viewing this show have never even heard before, at least before tonight. Words like Elkazites, how would you pronounce that?
Elkazites.
Elkazites, okay.
Elkazites.
The
We didn't get into
Ebionites,
Ebionites, didn't we?
the Ebionites, the Nazarenes. But before going into my conclusion, which we're going to need to do in just a minute or two for time, these words are so crucial to an understanding of authentic early Essene Christianity. Say a paragraph or two about these words: Ebionite, Nazarene, Elkazite.
These are the groups in the East that value the legacy of James, Peter as vegetarian. These are daily bathing groups. You ask the Dead Sea Scrolls group, which is why it's so important. The Essenes are considered to be responsible for the Dead Sea Scroll literature. We could go into a whole discussion about what kind of Essenes these were and what their mindset was. But in any event, whatever we mean by Essene, not your group maybe doesn't do this so much, but they were bathers. And the reason they were bathers, aside from being vegetarians and all sorts of other pure food-minded people, they were bathers because they were so deep, even in the desert, even in the wilderness, into bodily purity and cleanliness. They bathed in a daily ritual manner, and all these groups in the East were bathers. But they took cold baths because they didn't wish to be considered luxurious. They didn't anoint themselves with oil. They didn't use oil on their body after baths. They didn't use hot baths of the Greco-Roman style, the Greek-Roman athletes. These were basically pure-minded, ascetic people, and the teacher, the champion, the righteous leader of all these people was James. And all our literature tells us. And then, of course, if James did this, so did Jesus. We know that Peter from this literature did this. So was Jesus this way. And this is basically what you're teaching. So these groups called Ebionites, the poor, they called themselves poor because they were followers of a poverty regime of some kind, and James was the leader of the poor. The Dead Sea Scrolls also call themselves the poor. What does early church doctrine say about these Ebionites, these poor? They were poor because they had a poverty-stricken doctrine of the nature of Christ. That is, that they didn't recognize Jesus as a supernatural person, a son of God with all this miraculous mystery religion material focused around them. So the early church materials make fun of their poverty, just like Paul does of the church leadership in Jerusalem, heap abuse, heap scorn on them. We resurrect these people. We bring them back to life. So they're Ebionites, then the descendants of the Ebionites were the Elkazites, and so on, and it goes on like that.
Last question. Probably the question on our viewers'
Ebion
mind.
means poor, by the way.
Excellent. Last question, probably the question on our viewers' mind, and that is, where can they pick up your new book, James, the Brother of Jesus? Is this available in bookstores? What's the publisher? How can people get this book?
Well, that's published by Viking Penguin. It'll be out next year in a pocket version from Penguin, we hope. That's what they play in a paper pocket version, right? A paperback version. But at the moment, you can get it in any normal bookstore, I would think, any Barnes and Noble, or more or less carrying it. If they're not carrying it, go ask them that they should get it in, because a lot of Barnes & Noble in Southern California and other areas are carrying it, and any of your other bookstores like
B. Dalton type bookstore.
B. Dalton, maybe less so, but they can certainly order it there. But any of those, Brentanos, B. Daltons, any of those ones are basically carrying it. But Viking is the publisher, published in 1997 in March. They shouldn't have any trouble getting a copy of it, and I hope it's 1,000 pages. They'll get their money's worth, because I hope they'll get a lot of data they've never even heard or thought of before.
I want to thank you, Robert.
Well, thanks for having me up here, and thanks for doing the things that you're doing. I think you're trying to do a really good thing for mankind.
Thank you. I want to end by issuing an invitation. Those of you who have been touched by this interview with Professor Eisenman, those of you who would like to study for yourself the earliest records of Christianity, the Essene, Nazarene, Ebionite Christianity that we've been discussing tonight, you can call the phone number that's been flashing on your screen tonight. I'll send you a free information packet. As a matter of fact, if you need to ask again for the title of Dr. Eisenman's various books, you can call this number and I'll provide that information for you too. I invite you to come in contact with the early Essene Christianity. I'm the founder of a modern Essene Nazarene church, and we're attempting to follow these ancient Essene Christian teachings in modern America. We've thrown out the Apostle Paul, and we've brought in the brother of the Lord, James, the family of Jesus. We're practicing the vegetarianism. We're practicing the original teachings of Jesus in the scrolls that we've been discussing today. Call, write, and whatever you do, you have a wonderful day. Peace be with you. Shalom.